Welcome, everybody. This panel is going to be 90 minutes old. It's up till 4 o'clock in 30 minutes. Three participants. First of all, the lady Vessela Tcherneva. Should I present her? Sure, definitely. Vessela is Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Topics focus EU foreign policy, Western Balkans and Black Sea region, former foreign policy advisor of the Bulgarian Prime Minister Kirill Petkov, January-July 2022, former spokesperson of Bulgarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and member of political cabinet of the Foreign Minister Mladenov. Very recently, she was quoted by New York Times, "I worry that after so many elections, people will be ready to say, great, we finally have a strong, stable leadership in Bulgaria." But anyway, she is a unbelievably strong and tireless optimist for democracy, and somehow manages to spread her energy among the pro-European community in Bulgaria, even if it's not very big one, for many years. When things go badly, one can hear her say, so we have to redouble our efforts. So welcome to Vessela Tcherneva. Then Wojciech Przybylski, Editor-in-Chief of Visegrad Insight, President of the Respublika Foundation. He's a Europe Future Fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna and Erste Foundation. Co-authored the book Understanding Central Europe, 2017 published. He's publishing in foreign policy, Politico, Hospodarskie Noviny, Die Zeit, Gazeta Wyborcza, guest of BBC, Al Jazeera Europe, Euronews, TRT World, etc. He's going to present a strategic foresight report, How Democracy Can Win and Europe Lose. When I read it, I'm sorry to say it, but look, the four scenarios, there is a talking about the alliance of convenience, talk about the Renaissance, fractured horizons, shadows of the Union, which reminds me quite a lot of Game of Thrones, new season, or at least House of Dragons. So welcome, and very interesting to hear your report and your presentation. And the last, Dr. Garvan Walshe, welcome. Co-founder of Unhack Democracy. He works on security and defense policy, develops technology to counter propaganda, improve the quality of debate in the public sphere with his tech startup, Article 7 Intelligence. Irish national, former foreign policy advisor to the British Conservative Party, rather former, because a lot of time passed since then. PhD from the University of Manchester, published in foreign policy, conservative home. He's a research associate of Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, head of communications at the European Policy Center, etc. Just to give you a slogan of the Unhack Democracy: activating public-spirited citizens, politicians, and businesses, and to warn you that rewire your mind, rewire your country. Hope-based mindset shift incubator for civil society activists in Hungary, Poland, and Bulgaria. So welcome to the mind shifters from Ireland. So let's start with the lady. I'm in the business. I'm journalist, Deputy-in-Chief of Dnevnik BG in Bulgaria for more than 2 decades. Very recently, especially the last 10 days, I was thinking that my attention towards the international news is turning into just writing about the Black Swan events. Thinking about Slovakia, thinking about Iran yesterday. So now we are going to talk happily about the white swans of Europe. It's much more predictable, I hope. So please, the floor is yours, the conversation about the swans of Europe.
Thank you very much. This is supposed to be the predictable part. We're going to talk about data. And data in social sciences, of course, has limited, what should I say, explanation power, but it's still the best tool that we have to try and predict what is going to happen. As we know, there is a new big redistribution maybe of influence in the European institutions, especially in the European Parliament. And there is a question about whether the Parliament is going to shift to the right, to the far right rather, and whether there would be a new point of balance, a new kingmaker in the European terrain, whether this will be this time the European People's Party. We have tried to check various assumptions with regard to the European Parliament, but also with regard to the expectations of European citizens from the institutions. I will draw your attention to two publications. One was done by Simon Hicks early in the year, a forecast that I will mention, but also a public opinion poll that we did in January in 12 countries of the European Union, with basically who cover 75% of the European population. We tried to find out what is that really drives people's attention and people's fears, because obviously this campaign is based a lot on fears and anxieties of people. And as you can see, there are at least five, but we added also the sixth, the war in Gaza. So 5+1 crises that are driving people's motivations and expectations in this election. And this is by far not migration. It is actually different in different groups of countries. For some countries, mostly for the countries in the south, like Greece, like Italy, like Portugal, it's the economic crisis. And here, I think it is both about the kind of the follow-on from the 2008 economic crisis, but also the very recent inflation that has hit Europe via the war. For the countries in the front line or close to the front line, like Poland, but also the Baltic states, it's the war. Interestingly enough, COVID still is a very important driver, a very important memory in a number of countries. Most notably, this is Spain, but also in Romania and also Greece. And for people, but especially for the young people across Europe, and for a plurality of respondents in France and the Netherlands, it's still the climate change. Migration is actually very much less a concern that the far right is trying to portray it or is trying to convince us. Only in countries which are maybe more of a destination of migration, like the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria, migration is a real issue. In all of the rest of Europe, this is actually not very much an issue. And even if it is, you see, and this is probably the picture in Bulgaria, that most people worry about emigration, about people leaving their compatriots leaving their countries, rather than about immigration. And we can discuss that, but I think it is also the case that a lot of those societies who have experienced who have, the perception of the economic crisis or of the war being more prominent, for them, migration is clearly falling behind as a motivation. We have tried to see also what is the far right after. So if they are about fears, and if migration is kind of over emphasized. What is that they really are after? And it's very interesting that most of the voters understand that the far right has shifted, that it's not anymore about destroying the EU, destroying the European project. It's not about their country leaving the EU. It is actually much more about changing it from within, even if it would lead to breaking it up. I'm not going to go into details of this, and I'm happy to answer later on, but I think this one is particularly interesting. Giorgia Meloni's Italy, for instance, clearly moved to the European mainstream rather than to the far right, especially compared to Hungary of Orban, or to Poland, meaning peace. And this is a very good illustration of this idea that most of those anti-European parties are actually about breaking up the EU from within. This is especially valid for Kaczynski and Orban. Here, coming to the basics, what is that is going to change, and I'm sure colleagues will talk about it as well. This forecast is probably going to change 1 or 2 seats here and there, but the fact is that we see a decline of the center and a rise of the far right and a little bit of the far left as well. So this is why I was saying at the beginning that, as you can see, even though EPP is going to lose some votes, it will be the one to decide whether there will be a coalition on the right with the far right, or there will still be kind of a coalition in the center. And here you can see that this balance between the two is very fragile numerically. So basically there is no clear answer to what would be kind of the more stable majority, if we can talk about that. If you allow me, just using one very last minute, because you started about the white swans and the black swans, and probably I will contradict also myself a little bit by saying that, but I think this election is actually much less going to be about the left and the right. This election is going to be about whom we think is going to get us out of this mess. People clearly perceive many crises at the same time, and especially in countries with weak institutions, and we see this in Slovakia, but I believe we see this also in Bulgaria. There very easily can be kind of this tendency to think that there is not a set of institutions that can cope with a crisis, but that can be one person. And having this tendency connected or very much coupled with the kind of the accessibility of private interests, corruption, which immediately comes when there is a vacuum left by the institutions. I think this combination of kind of the authoritarian drive with the corruption fundament, if I can put it this way, could become the formula for a big group of countries as we go to the elections on the 9th of June.
Thank you, Ms. Tcherneva. This is the longer part of the thing I quoted from New York Times, your fears. So the next participant, Wojciech, is, you already have this report on your seats. I joked really about that it looks like a Game of Thrones, but look, the fourth and the least possible scenario starts like this. In the hollowed halls of the European Parliament, the alternative for Germany emerged as a dark horse, their victory sent shockwaves through the continent. It sounds like Game of Thrones, but anyway, seriously, what are these scenarios, and is there talking about a redefinition of the right, what the far right means this time? Because Vessela mentioned it. We're afraid that there are many people afraid that far right is growing in the popularity and probably in presentation, but should we talk about redefining what far right means? Wojciech.
Well, I'll try to address this question as well, and thank you for having me. Thank you, NIS, the CIVICS, ECFR, for partnering up in this important discussion. First, maybe I'll say what Visegrad Insight is, because it's a media platform, and it's, for a couple of years, started to serve as a think tank or analytical platform that builds on this media presence across the region. And our ambition is to not really to connect and make a coherent story from Central Europe, but in this very divided and geographically and politically divided region, to make a story for Europe from within, give voices in a structured debate on the future of Europe. And this is why we are engaged in strategic foresight. These exercises that produce similar reports are no less important, are no less focused on the reports themselves as on the debates that we're now having. And this is why it is really important to understand that debates like this, the voices from our capitals and our societies, are actively and more shaping the future of Europe. So here is what we're trying to do, structure our debate. That's merely that, and the dragons don't show up necessarily there, speaking of the House of Cards, but we're not shying away from some of the scenarios that are going to the far end of possibilities, only to map these possibilities as even extreme, because the reality is somewhere always happening between those borders in this framework. And why we do it, I think it's really important to remember that for about 7 or 8 years, Europe has woken up to Brexit and probably strategic foresight hasn't been done with societies and in public in a sense of communication ahead of Brexit, because the Brexit hangover meant that after taking a decision, taking a policy vote, there was a day after during which everybody started asking question, okay, what are the consequences? So in a sense, we need that kind of debate to treat ourselves seriously in Bulgaria as across Central Europe even more, to ask ourselves consequences of the decisions that are upcoming. So that's my initial remark. I'll have 5 points, and I'll try to address this question, which is impossible to answer strictly. So first, is it going to be a make or break of the EU, or are these the most important elections of our lifetime? To the first, I don't know. To the second, yes, these are the most important elections of our lifetime. So far, in 5 years, there will be another most important elections for the EU, because every elections are the most important when they happen. But here, these elections, I think what Vessela was already demonstrating in ECFR projections, are going to bring about a number of fragmentation in the European Parliament. Whether it's going to be the right-wing tilt, if you can describe it, or more, it's about center losing the middle ground and the influence on the whole. We will see eventually, but definitely management of the EU might look more difficult for the next 5 years. And these are troubled times. And of course, we're not escaping the context in which this particular vote is taking place. This context requires actual decision-making, more and more, difficult decisions, difficult debates. So the question is whether this polarized, or we wouldn't call it necessarily polarized, but more diverse representation in the European Parliament, and therefore more difficult decision-making is going to be a good thing. Some would say yes, it's democracy. Plurality is the key. But on the other hand, we know that there are many people who fundamentally disagree with certain decisions that are going to take place. And in the upcoming vote, we will also decide the so-called EU strategic agenda. EU strategic agenda is essentially the policy direction prepared by the policy leaders of the Union, which are prime minister, chancellors, one chancellor, and presidents in the council. But the parliament approves, and the parliament also confirms the commission. So it's really important to remember that while European Parliament, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of power, nominally speaking, it actually has in practice influenced the European decision-making, and has been so far a constructive actor, even an actor that has been pushing for more agency of the Union. So in these times, if we need more agency, we actually put forward a recommendation. One of the key recommendations that is so important to say in this forum is the civic education. We will need to have a parliament with a function that will explain and will embed democratic support for whatever decision and deliberation there will be, because these decisions which are upcoming are going to be sometimes very controversial or if not decisive sometimes for the EU, but they need to bring on board the European public. And European Parliament has this function. It has to also think and embody somehow the element of cohesiveness, and the cohesion in such a diverse, multipolar parliament will be of essence. Now, having that said in the beginning, we should remember that's my second point, that voting for the European Parliament and overall in these elections, as we constructed these scenarios, is going to be on one side about bringing about European power or European sovereignty, some people say, or the capabilities of the EU to a higher level, a higher gear, or lowering the potential. On the other hand, this is going to be very much about the democratic health, the performance in the EU institutions, and they are not perfect, we know, but also protecting democratic systems of which European Union is constructed. So, so the focus, I think, should be, and that's also a conclusion of our report, very much on ourselves in order to reinforce our institutions and reinforce democratic processes in order to deliver on the promise of European power. I think that it was too much to say 5 years ago that we want a geopolitical Europe. We're hardly geopolitical as European Union. But definitely one element that distincts European project from everything else in the world, that it's a sphere of democratic security so far. And that makes, I think, us so attractive. We should build on that. Three more quick points. European Parliament has served in the past as the voice of democratic consciousness, while the other institutions were doing different games. European Commission tried to be the geopolitical commission, that was the branding, but more times than not, it saw the limits of its ambitions. But the European Parliament has quite effectively a few times managed to influence democratic security agenda by pushing Article 7, by making emphasis on the rule of law conditionality, by also initiating a number of processes that led in the parliamentary debate on the questions of either human rights, civil liberties, or the big questions when it comes to Hong Kong or Taiwan. So I think it's important to remember that the European Parliament is also has this function and will have this focus. I would love to speak about the EU strategic agenda and what it means also with the Polish input into it, but maybe we can leave it for a discussion. I have a few points on that, but definitely what we're going to see is that there is a lot of security talk now among the leaders. I think there is a big impact of the voice from Warsaw. Donald Tusk's essential government message of Donald Tusk is security first and foremost. But then what kind of security is the question? And the EU agenda has changed since we've seen in the Granada Declaration from economic security alone or primarily to now 3 pillars in the early drafts that we see of the next upcoming agenda. Security proper, including defense, enlargement, and migration and borders. Security, economic security, point number 2 or pillar number 2, but also freedoms and democracy. This focus is now back, and this is something we have been advocating. And finally, my final point on the agency and the right wing, the role of the right wing. I tend to think, and I don't know yet really what is the answer to the role or redefinition of the far right or extreme right. I'm using rather Kasmude. I like Kasmude, simple and clear definitions of one being anti-democratic, anti-institutional, and the other simply pushing it to the boundaries, but still within the framework. I don't know what their role will be, but I think we should always ask the question how much they contribute to European agency, how much they are about European Union having agency in this world, within or externally, or how much they contribute to the limitation of the agency of our own institutions, and even especially when they're being elected to European Parliament.
Thank you, Wojciech. This just remind me that last week I was in a meeting with a old guard European. I wouldn't mention the name, but he told me when I asked him about Giorgia Meloni, what he thinks about her and her position as a ECR influential person. He said, look, she was noticed and introduced to me years ago by Mario Monti and Mario Draghi. Then suddenly all the talking about the far right in Italy, Giorgia Meloni specifically, not the other two parties, is becoming a little bit different and interesting. Now let's turn to Garvan Walshe. All is talking about the Europe as strategic player and security. Excuse me, but it reminds me of a knife without a blade. So the blade concerning the security, always you're thinking about NATO, about the country across the Atlantic Ocean, and you are here just to talk about the political strategies of the pro-European parties that can be adopted as a fight to expect radical right shift in Europe, and the security is one of the main points that is used by the far right. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Louisa, for convening this fantastic debate here. I like this talk about agency, and I like this talk about what does it mean to have this kind of strategy without a blade. Frederick the Great used to say that diplomacy without an army is like music without instruments. And the EU likes to have lots of instruments, but whether the right kind of instruments designed for the task at hand is a much deeper question. And I've got about 4 things to say here. I don't think I'll quite manage 5, I'm afraid. But the first one is that it's no longer 2016. The second one, and this echoes very much what has been said by both Vessela and Wojciech, that there are actually 2 types of right wing in Europe now, and let's talk about both of them. The third one is I'm going to talk about the vulnerabilities of Melonismo. So we may see that Meloni indeed is going to be a thread running through this whole discussion. And then I'm going to talk about the centre-right and what it means to be centre-right in Europe these days, and the dilemmas that being centre-right has for your political strategy. So when I was last involved in the Conservative Party was during the Brexit campaign. I was one of the Remainers, don't worry. And at that time we faced a pretty united anti-European nationalistic kind of movement. They talked about immigration. They said the EU was all completely wrong. They wanted to go back to the world of competing nation states that they believed had served Europe so well. Let's park that for a second. But this was their This was their agenda. Instead of being really close and being trapped in this straitjacket of excessive centralization, let's go back to being friends. Instead of being trapped in this terrible kind of divorce, let's be, friends a little bit more remote from each other, but that way we'll be able to get on better and cooperate better. This was the hopeful message of the Brexit campaign. But since then, two very important things have happened. One is that Brexit failed. It didn't achieve any of these things. We, of course, warned them that it wouldn't achieve any of these things, but the public didn't listen to us in large enough numbers. But they've nevertheless tried it. The UK hasn't got the kind of economic boost they said Brexit would give them. It hasn't got the greater global influence they said it would give them. And it hasn't got the renewed sense of national purpose they said Brexit would give them. In fact, Britain's suffering from particular economic decline, particularly in the manufacturing sector, where Brexit was very popular. It's suffering from a decline in global influence because people outside Europe particularly say, well, what the hell were you doing? And people inside Europe are still pretty annoyed about what they did. And finally, it's not leading to a new sense of national purpose in the UK. It's instead led to a lot of division in the UK as people argued over what Brexit was about. So a lot of right-wingers have said, hold on a minute, if we're going to be right-wing, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe there's something else we should do. And one of the people who has really been leading that charge has been Giorgia Meloni. The second split that's happened among the nationalist right in Europe has been the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because many of these so-called European nationalists, whether it's Rassemblement National in France, who might be better called Russie Nationale, whether it's the Konfederacja in Poland, otherwise known as konfederacja.ru for their website rather than .pl, or indeed various other, Matteo Salvini, whose henchmen were caught trying to actually raise money in Russia. The AfD, investigations have been opened into them for Russian spying. And before 2022, it was just about possible, unfortunately, but it was just about possible, particularly in Western Europe, to say, no, we just want better relationships with Russia. And that had a certain plausibility. Maybe Russia was misunderstood. Maybe there were things that we had got wrong. After that, that argument has become much more difficult. It doesn't land among the public. Even in places like Greece, which is the most pro-Russian country outside Russia in the EU, the Russians have been unable to gain support for their strategic agenda, and this is partly because of a number of mistakes they've made. But it just doesn't fly. And in countries like Portugal, where you don't really associate them with hotbeds of pro-Ukrainian feeling, 80 or 90% of the people support Ukraine. They think more should be done. It's something. The invasion has really touched something very deep in the European psyche. Something seeming like, hold on a minute, this stuff was not supposed to happen after 1945. Why is it happening again? And that's caused the alliance of nationalists, which between them could get on average of about 20% of the vote across Europe. It's caused this to split into two factions. One faction, the AfD, Matteo Salvini, is still pursuing the old pro-Russian line, but other than in France and the Netherlands, where there are particular reasons for the support that individual leaders have, they haven't really been able to maintain that support. Instead, we have a new kind of right-wing agenda that Meloni is leading. And this is four elements that are, we may say, are coherently conservative. It's strong on defense. It's anti-Kremlin. It wants a fortress Europe on immigration. Let's, make sure we have really tough migration policies. Let's not let asylum seekers in. Let's do deals with Albania so that some processing can happen over there. It's hostile to a lot of the green measures that have been developed recently by the European Parliament in the last few years, and it's economically protectionist, but crucially it is not anti-European in the broader sense. They don't want to go back to a bunch of member states cooperating loosely. They want to make Europe as a whole a more right-wing place. So if you're not a right-wing, but you're a pro-European, this has to change then what you do and how you respond to it. It's no good saying these people are just anti-European, because Meloni is not anti-European. And she wants a different kind of Europe, a more right-wing Europe, a more Marshall Europe, a Europe that's more hostile to immigration, but she still wants it to be Europe. She doesn't want it to be a group of member states anymore. Marine Le Pen still wants the other type, but it's a very different kind of phenomenon. And so if you're a pro-European on the center or the left or even the center-right, you have to think about that. So where is this new agenda, which is more coherent than the other one? The original, even on immigration, where all the nationalists agreed on in principle, they could never agree on a policy because Salvini wanted to distribute the asylum seekers around Europe, and the last thing Orban wanted to do was to get more of them into Hungary. So they couldn't reach agreement over practical migration policy. But this one is more coherent. So where is it vulnerable? And there are a number of issues. The biggest one, as we saw in Poland, is abortion. Trying to graft social conservatism onto this coalition isn't going to work because there aren't enough social conservatives in Europe broadly for it to happen. There are countries that might be where you might have a socially conservative right-wing vote, like indeed Poland, like in Bulgaria. There's others where it's quite different, like the Netherlands. It's very hard for this kind of alliance to stay together if the EU starts taking positions on issues like abortion, because it starts to divide the alliance. So one of the big lessons of just political tactics: pick things that unite your friends and divide your enemies. Don't pick issues that divide your friends and unite your enemies. On the environment, we can't quite be as directly into dividing lines as we can on things like women's rights, but we can. People are suspicious of a lot of the measures taken to deal with climate change. They don't want to be forced to organize a builder to put a heat pump into their house. But people are generally sympathetic to dealing with the environment. They want a nice environment. They want to deal with climate change. It's possible to think up of new kinds of policies that are a bit less into what you might want to call climate austerity, and are a bit more into adapting to people's lives and making a green life good. We keep talking about how high-speed trains are brilliant and a great way to get around Europe. So let's build some high-speed train lines instead of just making flying more expensive. There are questions about economics, and Meloni is particularly vulnerable on economic policy. She has no sensible economic policy. They want to ban artificial meat. They are very suspicious of artificial intelligence. They want to really fail to have any change in economic policy. But this is something where other forces, particularly the more liberal ones, have something to say, and they should be saying it. They should be having a positive, progressive sense of how they see technological progress happening, how they see us dealing with climate change with exciting new green technologies, how they see us building the unicorns in the tech businesses of the future instead of trying to block it all. And finally, the question of migration is probably the most difficult for the center and center-left, even more difficult for the center-right. But we're starting to see problems with a Fortress Europe policy. We have a labor shortage across Europe. Even countries like Romania have a labor shortage. Never mind the Netherlands, which has both a labor shortage and a housing shortage. It's a really difficult problem to solve. But you can start facing up to this problem as a difficult problem and saying, well, those guys just want to, build up a bunch of walls, but those walls are actually really expensive. It's costing us a lot of money to do deals with warlords in Libya to try and prevent people coming over to Italy and Greece to claim asylum. It's costing us, it's preventing us taking advantage of labor supply. I mean, lots of Syrians have come to Germany, but they've found it incredibly difficult to navigate a hugely bureaucratic German system of qualifications that they have. These people could be doing much better. They could be having far more interesting jobs, contributing to a German economy that's currently flatlining. But the old ways of doing things are preventing them from getting ahead. We can bring that debate actually into the public and say, look, this is a serious and difficult issue. It's not a simple question of, are we humanitarians who want to give people asylum, or are we horrible people who just want to drown people fleeing war and persecution? The real issues are much more complicated and much more difficult, but we can have that conversation with the public. And to bring me on to the last year of the center right, the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis is starting to openly have that conversation. He's deliberately moving to the center. He'd been quite relatively hard right leader of New Democracy, concentrating on economic reforms, but with pretty tough migration policy. And he's now saying, hold on a minute, well, that actually hasn't even worked for me. You know, we still have a lot of problems in Greece. We have to, now that our economy is doing well, we've got labor demand. How do we fill that labor demand? And actually this, you know, we in Europe are next to a region where there's lots of labor supply. Let's start thinking about how this can work more practically. So this it comes into the center-right tactics as well as the tactics of the center or the left. As long as there was a big united nationalist right-wing camp that could get 20%, you could imagine a center-right plus a right-wing uniting the right, as they said, making up 45, 50% of the vote and being able to govern. That doesn't work very well when you actually govern that way. There are lots of reasons why it's not very effective policy, as we found out in the UK. But it can assemble a majority. But now the war has made this impossible because the nationalist right is fundamentally divided on attitudes to Russia. And Russia policy is incredibly salient. You can't get away with being a European country and not having a policy on the war. There are this war. You can get away with not having a policy on Gaza, but you can't get away with not having a policy on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this means you have to pick. And if you have the center-right plus, you know, the Meloni type, the ECR, if you want to call it that, with a big asterisk about law and justice, because it's not clear that law and justice really fit into this new arrangement. If you have that, you get up to about 33, 35%. That's not enough to actually rule. So you need allies from the center and center left if you're going to win a majority there. So this is real. These dilemmas pose big questions about this sort of nightmare scenario. Is there going to be a far right takeover? No, there isn't. The numbers aren't there. In fact, there are ways to have either center left with a bit of center right European majority, or a majority that does tactical deals with someone like Meloni. Both these things are possible. So let's see then what will happen after the elections. But it's not going to be the nightmare scenario. It's going to be an evolution.
Now we're entering the Q&A session. Just to close these presentations with a very simple question. Are we talking about the 27 national elections framed by so-called European Parliament elections? Because you talked about the different approaches. You mentioned 4 scenarios. Ms. Tcherneva presented the national results. Or we are talking about the real European elections across the continent. It concerns the turnout. It concerns what the politicians are selling to the audience. As a journalist, I would completely skip the conversation about how do you reach the audience and the voters. 27 national elections or?
It's always 27 national elections. And in a country where we were going to have the national election on the same day, even more. But look, there are still some underlying themes that are common and some underlying trends that we hopefully, all of us, kind of demonstrated. To me, there will be maybe 3 big topics on which there will be a common answer during this election. One is how to calibrate the green agenda. Basically, is it going to be about curbing it? Is it going to be about reframing it? But there needs to be some sort of a course correction there that became visible. Secondly, how to react to the war. Maybe that's even the first one, but basically this is going to be decisive also in terms of enlargement, in terms of the next European budget, the next financial framework. And the third issue is going to be basically about so to say, the heart and soul of the EU. So what do we do with our democracies that means, do we continue talking about migration from this kind of very defensive point of view, or do we turn it into an opportunity, maybe working on our labor shortages? Do we take care about our democracies in terms of doing more on corruption, doing more on media, doing more on polarization? And to me, this is also going to be about Orban and, sorry, about Trump. I mean, how is Europe going to position itself in a world in which it will have to act alone much more than before?
Yes, 27 races, but the interesting points are what are the common discussions. And Garvan mentioned Meloni, which almost read like Donald Tusk in his speech from Katowice when they met with Ursula von der Leyen, and he presented 5 points plan of his version plan for Europe. Point number one, defense. Well, he says 100 billion euro easy on defense. Then we talk serious commitment. He's got national agenda in that, because we have national commitments for our own army and security and defense that requires European funding. So that's essentially he's between rock and a hard place also. But that's a European question of today, and very much connecting to the security, the hard security. Second point, he means migration and borders, and he means more borders than migration. That way he relates to what Macron said a few weeks earlier at Sorbonne, where Macron spoke at length, I don't know if you notice, about borders of Europe, that sovereignty requires that there are borders of Europe. And now we can argue where those borders are and should be, also because of the enlargement process. But the very fact of emphasis on borders is something that is part of a European discussion of today. Less so on migration. Migration is in Poland, it's not about migration. Poland, until the war broke out, was already for 5 consecutive years the main destination, or at least passage. But in terms of registered third country nationals who would take their residence in the EU, Poland was number 1 for 5 consecutive years until 2021. And then war happened and numbers went only up. I'm not currently sure what the number 1 is, but still, definitely, it's not a migration problem. I think it's because of the work, but it's about, and it's a very specific Polish, Finnish, and Baltic understanding of the challenge, which is not smuggling groups in Libya, but the state apparatus of KGB in Belarus and FSB and GRU in Russia orchestrating hybrid attack on the European border. And this is point number 2, very much aligned with what Meloni said. The point number 3 was economy, sort of between European protectionism. Our economy or our business actors shouldn't be treated worse than those away. So that resonates. And maybe this is in preparation to the scenario number 1 that is being explained exactly, that these elements connect and unite. Climate, it's a difficult thing, and I think all across the board we see EPP or Christian Democrats across Europe thinking whether car drivers are important electoral group for them, and they realize they are. Car producers, no less. And the fourth one, the fifth one, the last one, was actually Tusk was speaking something that resonated what you described in Meloni's term, with the love for Europe as a project. So he was committed in his last point number 5, to the emphasis on and Europe in its European integration, historical phenomena, kind of anchoring it down in the memory. And interestingly, yes, there was nothing of, you would say, agenda that brought this amazing turnout in the last parliamentary general election, which was the agenda on abortion, It was agenda on individual freedoms and choices, and a female agenda. None of that was present. So I think in terms of the upcoming EP elections, that will have an impact on the turnout, which might be simply lower.
Garvan, and please keep it short, please.
As we all know, there are 27 national elections. Political scientists call these second-order elections because people often use them to give their government a kicking. But they're elections with increasing European effects, even if people don't vote for that reason. So it matters who's in the European Parliament, because they get to choose who the next Commission president is. They have a veto over it, so in fact they have control. And Ursula von der Leyen, I think, made a mistake in choosing not to campaign for it. She had the chance to run as a local candidate in Lower Saxony. She didn't do it. Had she done so, she's one of the few figures with Europe-wide name recognition. She could have probably had what the Americans called coattails for presidential candidates, when you win your party extra seats. So she might have had, I'm picking numbers out of the air, but she might have given the EPP 10 or 15 extra seats across the whole of Europe. And that could make the difference, actually, between her being Commission President and her not being Commission President. Last time, her majority in the Parliament was about 10. So how does she get that over the line? This time is a very important question, because the Social Democrats didn't like her last time because they felt that their guy, Frans Timmermans, had it taken away at the last minute. The Liberals and Social Democrats are suspicious that the EPP is moving too far to the right for them. So if they try and do too many deals with Maloney and the ECR, they might end up with losing votes on the left and still not getting it through. So it's not clear that Ursula von der Leyen will actually make it over the line. Then the question is, who else would it be? I'll leave that one open. But these elections matter for that, even though voters in most of Europe won't be voting for the presidency of Europe at all.
Yes. Thank you, Garvan. Now I'm turning to our guests, hoping that you got part of the answers for your questions. Please present yourself shortly, and let's keep it no more than 2 questions, please. One is perfect.
It's unfortunate, but I have 2, but I'll merge them into one. But I'll just make a very quick remark, though. I always wonder what is the middle ground between polarization and fragmentation. You mentioned the UK. We saw what polarization leads to. In Bulgaria, we have instability largely because of fragmentation. But my key takeaway is that the middle ground is evolution, and I really like this positive note. And because it says here that we're caught between reality and hope, one of my question is, you mentioned, Vessela, that this election is about left and right, but to what extent do we hope that the big camps on the left and the right in the European Parliament will actually manage to stay close to the center? Because looking at the EPP campaign, they very largely co-opt and accommodate some radical right or far right issues and discourse of speech and politics. And I find this personally very worrying. And then the other one, if you give me a second, is, yes, and this actually relates to a sub-question. So you also mentioned coalition majority and whether we can hope for a stable one, but we know in Bulgaria, it's a very contentious issue to have situational majorities. So what about if these majorities are floating between policies? Because as we saw, Meloni is okay on Ukraine, but not okay on migration and so on. So what is the expectation to have some sort of a floating situation? Thank you. I would say it's whoever feels like addressing it. I think it fits in the context in general. Thank you.
Sure. I think that the whole issue about majorities in the case of European Parliament is a bit a connoisseur thing, right? Because we have a majority that puts together, that votes in the Commission, and then it votes on certain legislation, but actually this is not a government and this is not a parliament in the national sense of the word. Meaning the member states will be still the ones to have the biggest say. And from that perspective, having shifting majorities, I don't think is that big of a deal. It has happened in the past quite a lot, and it will depend a lot on the issues. And so I think, for instance, the Russia dividing line may be a dividing line in one case, but not so much a dividing line on other issues. And I really don't think, I mean, I hope Garvan is right, but I still think that the possibility of having kind of center-right, far-right, extreme-right, let's be correct, this type of majority on certain issues is not at all impossible. And we saw only 2 days ago Orban and Marine Le Pen and addressing Vox in Spain. I mean, those things that we know that they're not easy to unite, but they know it as well. And so they're working on it. And I know that there is a special institute in Hungary who has been doing a lot of polling, a little bit like the one we have been doing, checking what are the areas on which they overlap, kind of the brother parties across Europe. I'm sure they also have a good list. But to me, what is really worrying is much more the national kind of the national dimension of all of this, because we're going to see a surge of the right, of the far right in the European Parliament, but we're going to see this also in various national elections. We have this already in some member states. We saw now the Dutch government just a couple of days ago. We have several elections coming up this year and next year as well. We have a big French election at some point further down the line. And I don't want to be, you know, professing, because Peter also mentioned that I always try to be optimistic. I don't want to kind of betray my my public appearance here, my brand. But it is, I think this is what is worrying, that in the end we will have many more governments who have this kind of Eurosceptic attitude, and they will be sitting around the council table. We will have to be much smarter, much more intelligent, and we will have to be much more adaptable in our societies, but also our politicians around the council table.
We have breaking news from the Die-Hard Optimist. Gentlemen, if you want to answer the question.
I spoke at length, so I can only say that I think ECR, the European Conservative Reformist Group, declined Orban the possibility of a membership eventually. So that's a week from last week, if I'm not mistaken, in this sense. And it's very hard for him to build anything. It simply takes time and a lot of effort that is unlikely to succeed in terms of making a grouping, a political grouping. I know they're trying.
If Trump comes, there will be much more weight, I think. I don't want to overtalk Orban's value and weight, but I think there will be a change in the general mood.
If I may say so, here on this point of House of Game of Thrones, not House of Cards, but anyway, they both connect. They both connect, and it's a binge watch we're all addicted to. Unlike Lancaster, Trump never pays his debts.
Okay.
Let's hope that on the 6th of November we will already have a new commission, because then it's rather complicated in Brussels and Strasbourg.
I mean, to take two things. One is the good news is whatever the EPP campaign says centrally, no one is listening to it. Nobody in any European country is paying the slightest bit of notice to what they've been cooking up in EPP headquarters, because there are 27 national elections. They are listening to what the CDU are saying, or what the Partido Popular are saying, or what Donald Tusk is saying, but what the EPP headquarters says isn't noticed by anybody. in Europe, for better or worse. What is more interesting and more worrying, of course, is this point about fragmentation. And I think fragmentation is just going to be something we're going to have to get used to in our politics. The era of big center-right and center-left politics, which is in any case a kind of projection back on a much more unstable post-war democratic world than actually exists. This is the kind of, we think, oh yeah, the 40s to 80s, they were center-left, center-right, alternating in power, but we had Algeria in French, we had the collapse of the Fourth Republic, de Gaulle, we had the civil rights crisis in the United States, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Weathermen. In Britain, you had major strikes in the late 1970s, the 3-day working week because they couldn't generate enough power to actually keep industry going on. Even in these, very large, famously stable countries, we actually had a lot of political instability. That's normal, and we shouldn't project back an idea of perfect decisiveness because it happens to fit into a political science model here. It was much messier in the past, and it's going to be messy in the future, and we need to just learn to manage that mess because it's normal. Yes, we're in very difficult situations right now, particularly because of the war, particularly because we've had things like the pandemic, because we lack a positive economic agenda. One of the big things I would encourage the centrist parties to do is start talking about enterprise and empowerment and give people some economic hope again that their lives are going to get better. This is where the green messaging has been catastrophic, because it's been saying, and I blame Ed Miliband for this. I actually blame Ed Miliband for everything, but we could talk about that later, because he said, look, we've got a carbon budget, we've got this is the amount that we can emit, and our job is to continually emit less. Bring this down. Essentially, he's like some kind of slightly different version of an order liberal German saying we can't ever borrow any money. And as a result, it's been, people think, oh, well, we've got to save money, we've got to do less, we've got to do stuff. And people are saying, well, hold on a minute, we've just had 20% inflation. Life is really tough. We can't tolerate this. The way we're going to get out of this is by learning how to build our economies in a new way that just pollutes less, not by having less economy. And until we make that shift in environmental policy and make that shift in economic policy, the centrist parties who depend on making these practical kind of economic arguments aren't going to be able to take the initiative back. And they need to take the initiative back, and the road to centrist initiative goes right through the economy.
Yeah, thank you, Garvan. It starts to look a little bit like keep calm and ... The audience, next question.
Myself. Ivan Lutzkanov here. So you talked in great detail about this right shift in European politics. And, well, it is actually a shift in voter preferences, if we phrase it that way. So my question is, how long do you think this shift is going to last? Are we talking about a new short-term trend where we complain about the right shift for 5 years and then we have another 5 years complaining about the Greens and then 5 years of something different? Or are we observing a long-term change in the way Europeans look at things? Would you try to make some prediction about it? Obviously, we can't know the future, but analyzing the reasons behind it, you might have a clue.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take one more. One more question. Yes, please. Could you please repeat it? You're interested more in the turnout, the voter turnout. Okay. 2 is enough. I don't know. Probably it was a question. The first one was about the purpose of everything else.
I'll have a go at the first one. I think the big thing that's going on, if we were to take a really long-term view, is that we're in the middle of a period of two-way globalization. In Europe, we were really good at globalizing for about 500 years. We sent our people, our money, our armies. We globalized everywhere. We did an awful lot of immigration. And we, ended up controlling most of the world as a result. Then other parts of the world adapted. And guess what? We don't like these ideas coming back. We don't like Chinese money, Islamic political ideas, people from everywhere else. This causes a lot of discomfort. And the nationalist answer to this discomfort is to say, let's put up a bunch of walls. So the conclusion of that view is that this is going to be with us for some time. There are always going to be people who will be able to say, the world's a complicated, dangerous place. We're no longer, and you see this particularly in big countries, because small countries were never particularly sovereign anyway. But when they were massive empires, Britain and France could do what they liked in the world. And if you were a British or French voter, you got a guarantee of what you wanted. Now that's not true anymore. They're medium-sized countries. They're buffeted around the place. So if you're going to be this kind of medium-sized country or a small country, it's very easy to come along and say, Marine Le Pen saying, don't worry, I'm going to restore the world that used to exist. You, as a French person, will get what you want. No one will be able to interfere with you. And that's a powerful piece of rhetoric. So we're going to have this for some time.
You mentioned for some time, you mean a generation? Let's not talk about the years, but generation probably?
I guess, particularly until the France is an exception, and like in most of the hard right tends to gain its support from people in their sort of 50s to 70s. France, it's different. Their peak hard right support is between people like 35 to 55. So outside France, it's probably a generation. France, it's probably 2 generations where this will still go on.
Okay. Anyone on the first question? Or on the second?
Maybe I can take the second one, but couple it with what Garvan just said.
Yep, please.
On the turnout, last time around, if you remember, the turnout for the first time went up because there has been a tendency for, 6 election or 7 election that the turnout would constantly go down, and then last time it went up back again for the first time. Why? Because people got really scared that the far right wants to terminate the European project, and they went out to vote in big numbers, and a lot of young people went to vote as well, and this is why the whole green agenda had a huge boost. It also coincided with the Renew Europe cycle, Macron's push to bring France back into the European mainstream, that also brought in new votes. And so this produced the European Parliament, which actually had more legitimacy in terms of the votes, but also kind of was more centrist than expected. I don't think this is going to happen now for 2 reasons. First, the reason that we all 3 mentioned, namely that the far-right parties have become much less focused on destroying the EU. They're now much more about reshaping the EU according to their own model, to their own kind of way of thinking. But also, I think a lot of the campaigning has been built on people's anxieties. And when you have a defensive agenda, when you don't have, so to say, a grand vision against which you can rally new voters, it's usually, you basically try to make people to vote for the status quo. And, maintaining the status quo is basically the most difficult thing, because usually it tends to go down. So I would say we would be really lucky if we got the turnout from last time, but I don't think we will have that. On the positive note, this is a chance, I think, for Europe to really think about redefining itself. So it will be an election in flux, of a continent in flux. And if it gets a mandate for this defense and security agenda, this is already going to be a way out of this kind of interregnum. And this is why I think having also a very clear agenda for the Commission to work on common European defense, to work on strengthening European competitiveness, to work on getting Europe better equipped for a very, very difficult world out there is going to be crucial.
Wojciech, mid-October, you have a unimaginable turnout on the national elections.
I wanted to refer to that, but I also wanted to combine the point on the right wing or the far right even increase. And I wanted to say in the very beginning that as long as we have the war, the dominant narrative and the dominant political message is going to be about security, and security is driven here by statescraft. We need politicians to talk about it. Now, naturally, it will create a backlash at some point because societies don't want to talk about external security that much. And the backlash will come either because we will lose the war, and this is a European war we can lose. And you can imagine a situation that the flower power of Europe will take over, like after Vietnam in the US, creating a ripple effect and the political elite or political culture of Europe in a sort of unpredictable way as well, but it can generate new impulses and political culture. And it can be also a certain victory of in the war that will also produce a necessity of decompression of later of the security discussion. So in a perspective, of course, this is not indefinite, the rise of the far right, but to prepare for that and to do something with that, that is really the question, because as I mentioned and as I referred to the elections in Poland, and the turnout in Poland was higher, and it gave a premium to the forces that made the change possible. These were primarily younger voters, and these were female voters with an agenda, with a more progressive agenda, or at least women's rights agenda. Now, you don't have that currently in the security language, in the discourse on security, which builds up the right wing of more conservative outlook of the world. And I think this is underinvested, but we should be mindful also that in the demographic decline, of course, the resource to mobilize this kind of voter is increasingly more and more costly. Simply, you need to invest much more and more to mobilize this part of the electorate, which is smaller and smaller.
Thank you. Well, one of the co-authors of the ECFR poll that Ms. Tcherneva quoted at the beginning, Mr. Simon Hicks, we took an interview, and we're going to publish it in Dnevnik in the next couple of days. We asked him specifically about the turnout, and his message was something like, watch out what you're wishing for, because there are different countries, different voters across Europe, and in some places you want them to go up, in some places you prefer they to stay home. So it's always dangerous to generalize about the turnout in the European elections.
In the Bulgarian case, it's very clear. So let's have people go out, please.
Yes, please go. Another question from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, Jordan Bujilo, Sofia Security Forum. How do you assess the role of Russia in these elections? The Parliament and European Commission already warned about possible Russian meddling in the election. Do you think it's a factor? By the way, I watched today some of Bulgarian candidates. I mean, we don't need Russians to spread pro-Russian propaganda in Bulgaria, believe me. But do you think it is a factor? Do we do enough to prevent Russia influencing the results?
I can start as Poland, yes, exactly. As Poland has this label of knowing everything about Russia. Ursula von der Leyen, which is not true. Ursula von der Leyen had even this pitch for the Polish public. Oh, you know everything about Russia and history. You have the history and foresight on Russia. We should have listened. We should have listened. That's the usual mantra. Poles love that. Whenever you want to appeal to our vanity. Every election is an opportunity because it's a moment of weakness for the institutions, and it's clearly so in these elections as well, then we may have a certain, as an effect, more agents or people aligned with Russia perspective in the next parliament and in institutions as well. The last elections we had open up a whole sweep, and we're still sweeping how our institutions were penetrated, including public companies in Poland, by people specifically linked to GRU and FSB. So-called Collegium Humanum, Google it, has been set up a bypass way to obtain the special MBA on a fast track for those who would then sit on public companies of strategic importance. And there were many who were simply, because of that, basically placed through by the previous government in these companies. Now, the recent investigations have demonstrated Collegium Humanum has been directly linked to the Russian institutions, and people who were employed there in the public companies, but also in many government institutions, had influence, but also they were taking intelligence about our strategic assets. What I want to say is that it's not about messages and the narrative so much. It's about the effect of the elections that we need to look at. The narrative, I think you're right. There are all different kinds of narratives, but we're past the narrative battle. Narratives were spread for the past 20 years or so. Now we are in the times of a real war, where the narrative served to weaken our position in this war that is happening. That's why we're not having ammo production already. We don't have defense union as we should have had already, because they've been weakening us for the past 20 years or so. Now, are they dangerous today for us? I don't think that much. I think it's much more what we are, if we are dangerous to ourselves because we were poisoned by this Russian virus from before. Are we, capable of pulling our strength for the vaccine? But I don't think Russian meddling is today the problem number one. It's the effects of it that were installed in our societies already.
Anyone?
Not only does Poland know everything about Russia, but Poland was also the last foreign power to successfully occupy the Kremlin in the 17th century. Mistake to leave?
No, a mistake to even try.
But the one thing the Russians are very good at is subversion and infiltration. There are a number of leaders of Western countries that have had significant relationships with Russia over the last 20 years. And I mean Gerhard Schröder, obviously, Silvio Berlusconi, François Fillon nearly became president of France. And we can also always talk about Donald Trump in the United States. And there are lots of lesser figures as well that were also involved in this sort of co-optation by money. Because what Russia's managed to exploit is the openness of our financial system to channel resources into a patronage network that converts Russian natural resources into political influence in Europe. The weakness Russia has, however, is they then do stupid things like invading Ukraine. So they can exercise a lot of this influence, but then they do something openly that makes that influence extremely clear. Whether it's Bidzina Ivanishvili trying to destroy Georgian civil society, whether it's the guys who shot down the Dutch airliner, totally converting Dutch policy. Before that, the Netherlands had been one of the countries most sympathetic to Russia because of large-scale oil interests with Shell. And then you shoot down a plane full of Dutch people, and guess what? It changes. So Russian infiltration is there. It's a serious problem. We need to continue to expose it. We need to develop more instruments to protect ourselves against strategic corruption. And I would like to say that this shows that democratic decline is not just a problem for the citizens of the countries where authoritarian populists come in. It's also a strategic problem because it opens up EU member states to influence by Chinese and Russian authoritarian leaders. So we need to clean up our house there. We need to reinforce that. And then we need to start taking the actions that make us understand that there are strategic threats in this world. We're not in 1993. Strategic competition is real, and we need to put our resources into that strategic competition.
Thank you very much. This reminds me of Monsieur Macron's speech, great speech in a couple of weeks ago. Mark Leonard published his comment on Project Syndicate. He said, great speech, now please deliver. So many things, and the things you mentioned, are known for many years in Europe. Now please deliver, do something about it. Do we have time for one more round, or should we keep? I think because we started a little bit later. Yes, I was going to suggest just the final words for this conversation.
I was thinking about Jordan's question about Russia in the last round, and the more I think about what happened in Slovakia in the last couple of days, the more worried I am, because whether it's Russia itself, it's the Russian proxies, or it's the imagination of Russia, or it's the idea that just everything is out for grabs, whether it's our social media or the weakness of our institutions, whether it's the strategic corruption and our dependencies, all of those things separately we could tackle, but having them all put together, it produces a kind of extreme sense of vulnerability. And I think the Slovakia example is exactly that alarm bell that sounds. We are on the verge of basically losing the sight of what comes next, and I think this is a great test in a way for our democracies, whether we can cope with that. So when we say it's Russia, it's not only Russia, and we have to be aware that a lot of that really actually depends on us and on our matureness as societies to deal with all these different kind of risk factors together.
Wojciech?
Yeah, I'll circulating to how much we had Ursula von der Leyen and still Donald Tusk in last week. But one thing in the framing of the discussion that was happening in Poland struck my ears, because we've been discussing, and actually this project on scenario has been very much attached to it, is the question, it's a moral question that we haven't even touched so much. I think it's in the background of our heads, but I think it needs to be much more in the open. What is evil, what is good in these elections and in European democracies, and democracy in bigger parentheses. This moral question is really important, and asking it's really important because it in a way helps us to escape these dilemmas of dependency and bring back agency. We have been building our foundations of the European project, and it can continue only if we ask the right questions. They need to involve the questions of our values, and in that sense, openness and all the values that we have committed ourselves, because of which Europe exists. Russia does not want to do this in their strategic communication. Actually, it invites us to discuss everything else but the values, or ridicule these values in many ways. I think we need to devote much more time. If I have a reflection point on our debate, we need to discuss this even more, because otherwise we are getting into a bit of a trap. And I think we are with this discussion, we're also in on a good direction.
Good one.
The big slogan of Unhack Democracy is defend democracy and it will defend you. And what it is really, it's a plea to agency. Democracy depends on us, and it will survive if we want it to survive. And if enough of us decide to take the steps to get involved, and defend democratic values and democratic politics. And that starts with moving beyond analyzing things that might happen and taking up the agency we all have in a democratic society to be Democrats and to be political activists and to go out and do things. If necessary, it might maybe stand for election, knock on doors, mobilize people, talk to individual voters, even people you would have never thought you would need to speak to ever. Go out of these cities, get out into the countryside and into the villages, find people you disagree with or half agree with, and talk to them. And that's part of this process. And when you're talking to them, remember that we're all emotional creatures. It's great to be able to say, you know, here's a bunch of facts. That doesn't convince anyone. But and while we have negative emotions, and we have fear, and we have the sense that if we're very scared, we want someone else to go and take that fear away, and that's what authoritarians rely on. We also have positive emotions about belonging, about cooperation, and build these into what we're saying. Because together, as citizens of European countries, and indeed citizens of countries beyond Europe, we can show that there is a better way to live than the gospel of fear that the authoritarians want to sell us. We can show that democracy is good, that progress is possible, and that it's not just about hope in an empty kind of way of saying, well, let's hope something turns up. It's hope in the sense of let's actually go out and build that better world. Let's remember that progress matters and that it depends on all of us to actually implement it, to bring it about. It's not some other people out there, the politicians, who will bring about progress. It's us. It's all of us in this room. It's all of us listening on the live stream who will make these changes and who will secure democracy for Europe in the next 20 or 30 years.
Thank you, Garvan, and thank you, Vessela, that you mentioned the Slovakia case. As a journalist, I'm still waiting almost a week later to hear the surgeon who operated the prime minister, and I'm always listening to the Minister of Defense. So thank you for having this bunch of democracy surgeons. Talk to the people who understand and know the field. Don't talk to the Minister of Defense. If you want to talk for democracy, for the elections, choose your partner and your questions, address of your questions. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you to the audience. Thank you very much.